All right, Mike, how you doing? Thanks for doing this. I'm looking forward to the chat.
Great. I'm doing great, John. Nice getting the chance to talk with you.
Yeah, we've been friends on Twitter, I guess, for a while, and it's nice to finally put a face to the avatar and or the profile pic and talk about some of our mutual interests. I know when you hit me up, I think at least one of the topics you wanted to discuss was anarchy, which I always find to be an interesting subject, and obviously it's very misunderstood in the broader cultural context. But I'll just hand it over to you to introduce yourself as much as you would like, and then maybe break into what you want to talk about.
Great. Yeah. My name is Mike Matulef. I'm just kind of a blue collar pleb like so many other people out there. And I am an anarchist philosophically. And I was before I came into the Bitcoin space. And the reason I wanted to talk with you was kind of to just reflect on the whole like orange pilling and going down the rabbit hole that like we use in the Bitcoin community to kind of describe our experience with Bitcoin. And I think a lot of that imagery is borrowed from like the Matrix movies.
Mm-hmm.
And it really is to kind of describe this, this way of kind of to reflect on the fundamental reality of our life, and some of those preconceived notions that we have. Um, yeah.
Well, that gives us a lot of space to swim around in, I suppose. But maybe to start, like what came first for you, anarchy or Bitcoin? And it would be interesting to know how, in both cases, you came to those positions or topics.
Yeah, so I think my journey really began around 2010. I just became really enthralled with the liberty movement. I became enthralled with Austrian economics, and that was kind of the jumping off point for me. Um,
Ron Paul sort
and
of guy.
yeah, I'm a big proponent of Ron Paul. And then I was heavily trying to get active in, the Libertarian Party. And, around 2013, I kind of had, some disenchantment or disillusionment with, the state of the liberty movement for practically achieving liberty. And I kind of had an existential crisis with what I was doing with my life, and decided to, you know, switch, transition, my career, and I just kind of accepted that, this is the world that we have to live in. Got to try and live in it as best we can. And it really wasn't until like 2021, when Bitcoin, I guess that's when I really took the orange pill. I'd heard about it in the past, but I never did the work.
Mm.
And for me, the Bitcoin represents, a practical solution to achieving, liberty. And I just, that was the hook, line, and sinker for me, and it's been like that ever since.
Interesting. So in 2013, when you say you became kind of disillusioned with the liberty movement, I think, I certainly felt that way earlier in the timeline for me, but I know a lot of Bitcoiners, people that subsequently became Bitcoiners, felt that at some point. You have potential, is ideology, is the desire to have your ideology adopted, throughout the world more broadly, is that idealistic? Almost certainly, right? And so especially especially if there's a mismatch, and anyone who's liberty minded in the world today, especially at that time, but of course still, would have seen a mismatch between a liberty oriented ideology and what prevailed in the world at the time. And at least from my perspective, I was disillusioned in the same way. And I was despondent, and I kind of I didn't like what I gave up in order to do what you just said, which is kind of just like move forward pragmatically and practically. Well, throw up your hands. I can't really change the world. It's all going to hell anyways. At least I can carve out a little, slice of world for myself and the people I care about, and maybe that's good enough. And that, there's always a pragmatism in that approach. I mean, you have to do that regardless. But I felt a certain disappointment in that approach, because it meant you had to give up on, you know, a certain aspect of your idealistic notions. And we often use the term idealistic as being like, you know, people use it with naivety, right? Like you think like, oh, if you're being idealistic, you're being naive. But and there's some of that, you know, you got to be careful where you draw the line. But I think it's really important to have, you know, what you believe to be the ideal predicated on very clear, paramount, fundamental values and principles that you are going to orient your life by. And if you're saying like, well, I'm going to give up on that, then of course it's going to eat away at you a little bit, because you're basically saying like the things that I think are best to orient my life by and that I'd like to see out in the world are not being appreciated or accepted or adopted out broadly in the world. Doesn't mean you can't embody them yourself. And I think that's the responsibility that we all have, is to embody the values and principles that we actually think are right, true, and good, regardless of what the broader circumstance we find ourselves in is, what's going on there. But all the better if we can close the gap, if we can embody those things and they're being appreciated or upregulated or incentivized out in the broader world. And at least for me, you know, that was one of the things that Bitcoin, what made me so excited about Bitcoin is like, oh, this looks like the instantiation of those very values and principles that I had that were so elevated in my own mind, and a mechanism for their propagation out into the world. It's like, wow, great. Like now this actually seems like an actual practical method of getting those principles out into the world, because prior to that, it just seemed insurmountable. It's like, yeah, sure, you think whatever you want about what the best principles for a flourishing and free society might be, but who gives a shit? You ain't gonna turn around that boat, you know, or you're not gonna turn around the Titanic there. And Bitcoin, you know, changed that perspective for me. And for me, that was why that feeling of despondence and despair turned to enthusiasm and hope and energy and that kind of stuff. So I know that was long-winded, but was that kind of a similar thing that transpired in your life, or were there any differences?
Yeah, that sentiment echoes, you know, with my experiences a lot. You know, you try, like you said, try and just live the principles that you can, you're in your individual life, and, you know, be committed to that. And the world will be what the world is. And we like to try and convince other people, you know, to try and see our way of looking at the world. But, you know, it can be very difficult, as a lot of Bitcoiners know.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that Bitcoin also gives you is, and you have to be careful anytime you have too much confidence, but one of the things I have enjoyed is when previously you would be trying to espouse or argue the merits of your particular ideology or philosophy in, you know, family dinners or cafes or whatever. And it's just so hard that way, because people are so set in their ways and their perspective that I don't think even logically, you know, logical, well-articulated, rational, historically backed up arguments are all that persuasive. But what is persuasive is success. And most people convey success in a very similar way. It's financial security and stability, happiness, good relationships, health, freedom, options to do what is meaningful to you, whatever that might be. Like that, those are all pretty much, everyone will agree that constitutes success. And what I think Bitcoin's allowed many to do is to achieve success through those principles that they were previously trying to argue for, but now they can just represent them in their life, and the benefits of doing so are evident, or at least they're becoming, you know, more and more evident. And that's way more convincing. You know, you don't have to sit around the dinner table and argue for libertarianism, anarchism, small government, you know, whatever other thing. You can just be emblematic of the success of those ideals, principles, and tools. And that's what I think changes people's minds. Because, you know, when you get into a discussion or an argument like that, people just throw up defenses right away, and then you're just arguing for your side. And there's not many times where someone goes, you know what, that was a great argument, I totally agree, I'm going to completely change my worldview now after this discussion. You know, that's pretty rare.
Yeah, you know, I agree. And, you know, the thing that I find fascinating about anarchy is, you know, people's preconceived notions of what it means. I think for a lot of people that aren't maybe familiar with some of the material, they kind of envision, like a Mad Max type of scenario, or a Molotov cocktail wielding, rioter. And from my experience, a lot of people, even if they may not call it anarchy, prefer anarchy, and I think that's exemplified in their daily lives. When I would sit around the table talking with my family and family members, I stopped calling it anarchy completely, just because of the, just the word, the baggage that's associated with that, and you're trying to unpack all that. It's just it is a lot of work to do, and you're right, they're not going to do it. But if you come from it from a standpoint of, I'm a volunteerist, I espouse that all human exchanges should be voluntary. I think it's kind of harder for them to kind of push back against that, and they still do, of course, but just reframing things is really important.
Yeah, I agree. And, it's still an open question. I mean, ideologically and philosophically, I want every individual to have as much decision-making latitude, freedom broadly as possible. And in these conversations that you'd be having, when you frame it in that way and not with the, anarchy and all the baggage that comes with it, basically you're forcing the other person to say, well, I think someone else should be in control of at least a portion of your life because you're too stupid, dangerous, incompetent, wild, crazy, whatever, in order to do it.
Free market doesn't work.
Right. We all are when we reach a big enough scale. And again, even though I disagree with that in principle, you can't, you have to accept the real world reality of what's happened, and because I think in all places where human beings congregate, owing to our different capacities and our different talents and our different dispositions and stuff, depending on what the end we're trying to achieve is, leaders usually do emerge. And like there's obviously, we benefit from having rules of engagement in whatever domain we're talking about, because then everyone understands how to interact with one another, and that fosters cooperation and creativity and production and that kind of stuff. And I can appreciate that people who have a big aversion or are scared of, that sort of voluntarist approach, because I'm not sure prior to Bitcoin such a thing was even possible, to have rules without rulers. Like before Bitcoin, on what basis could we? Because if you're going to have rules, you need to be able to enforce those rules. You need an authority of some kind to enforce rules. Otherwise, they can too easily be broken. So prior to Bitcoin, how could you have an anarchist society? And I guess that's a question for you, because you probably spend more time on thinking about it than me. But
I don't think you can, honestly, because it's not that anarchists are against rules. They're against rulers. But
you needed rulers to enforce rules up until you have this distributed authority system, let's say in Bitcoin. So again, I can appreciate that it's a foreign concept to people, or it doesn't seem very practical, because potentially up until 2009, it was only possible in theory, let's say. Maybe I'm wrong. There's probably some hardcore anarchists out there. I'd be like, oh, you don't know about this particular example. But seriously, how do you have rules without an authority?
It's hard, because if people want to have rulers, it's kind of hard to have a system, opposite of that. And I think for a lot of anarchists out there, they're not saying that, we have anarchy today, that there are systems of anarchy, or maybe before Bitcoin. But it's kind of this mental shift and recognizing the underlying foundation of those social institutions, namely the state. And instead of saying that it's voluntary, that it's really coercive at its foundation.
Well, that's the age-old problem that we find ourselves in the middle of. Like, how do you have a rule? And this is, for the well-intended approaches to politics that we have throughout history. Let's say the beginning of the American experiments is probably the best example. you
It's
had
the
people that,
greatest experiment and,
right,
small limited government that, we've ever seen.
right. And I mean, look where it's
Look what
led.
it's become today. Yeah.
So, and I would think, again, none of the people involved in the founding principles of the country were perfect, as nobody is, but it seemed like they were all, or majority, genuine, as far as I can tell, genuine in attempting to do what we're kind of describing is, how do you establish rules because of the benefit that having rules conveys to liberty, production, freedom, flourishing, prosperity, while having an authority that you are able to keep in check, right? How do you do that? And it seemed like the American experiment is was the best thus far in trying to architect something that appreciated how easy it is and how common, how inevitable perhaps it is, that the authority that is established to enforce those necessary rules becomes corrupted. And so how can we architect something that prevents that maximally? And you gotta hand it to them for the time and for the circumstance. Man, there was some enlightened thinking that
it's hard to even fathom anything like that happening today.
right, exactly, exactly. And so it was tremendously enlightened thinking that went into that. But I think it's almost like you bump up against an unsolvable problem, or at least unsolvable like forever. Maybe you solve it for a period of time, but history shows that like it's just maybe one of those unsolvable problems. It makes me think about, and this is part what makes me wonder about how you should balance ideology and pragmatism or practicality. And it makes me think about the sovereign individual, right? And in that book, have you read The Sovereign Individual? I suspect, yeah. So in that book, they talk about these mega political technological shifts that dramatically change basically what's possible in the realm of politics and governance and authority and rules. And but it makes me think like, well, up until a shift like that happens, you can argue for a particular rule set or society or what have you until you're blue in the face, or until you get executed for for being such a dissident perhaps. But it doesn't really matter until the constituent technological capacity is in place for such a system to prevail, to prevail. So not only to be started, but to be sufficiently robust and incentivized that it actually ends up prevailing and supplants the prior system. And, so up until, again, back to this up until Bitcoin sort of thing, I guess all you could have done was these valiant efforts at trying to use authority to establish rules while simultaneously hamstringing that authority so that it doesn't get out of control. And again, as brilliant as, that was 250 years ago, as you say, I mean, look where it's led. Then, maybe it's still the best of a batch of a lot of experiments, but look at the size of government, look at what they've done all over the world, look at, what the citizens are under, in perhaps in many cases unbeknownst to them. It certainly seems like a dramatic departure from what the founding fathers, what those people intended the country to become. And again, like, are we in a situation now, and is this part of the impact that Bitcoin is going to have, that forever's a long time, so I hesitate to say it solved a problem forever, but is it that mega political technological shift that's going to permit far greater freedom because it allows for a rule set to be enforced absent an authority that can be so easily corrupted? So does this give us a longer runway and a broader berth of freedom because of this technological change? I mean, obviously, that's kind of my assertion, but I'm wondering what you think.
So, yeah, I mean, like going back to, the founding fathers, their idea of extremely limited government, their idea of the government was, it was to protect the property, the people and property. And, even though it was on the, foundation of, a coercive exchange, they tried to put the technology at the time, which was the Constitution, to try and limit that that corruption so that it could never grow into being, what the system was that they left. Unfortunately, as we see today, it really has not stopped the growth of, that corruption. And yeah, I agree that, Bitcoin is a tool that I think is ushering in, something that obviously we never had before. It's a system of, crypto anarchy as a tool of, building these parallel systems of, cooperation, that could possibly flourish, whereas otherwise they wouldn't have been able to before.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as critical as I am about the state of affairs in the world and how excited I am about what Bitcoin represents, both technologically as well as, which we'll probably get into later, kind of how it has been transforming, those who are most aligned with it or most use it. But isn't it fascinating that, so let's say, it's been 250 years roughly, and things have kind of gone off the rails. Not totally yet, like hasn't completely fallen apart yet, but it's pretty bad. But isn't it just wild as a premise that a handful of people in a place, in a time, can write down some words on a piece of paper and, they derive the authority from force ultimately, right? So win the Revolutionary War, have the army, these are the rules now. So that's where it derives its authority, but it's still so fascinating that, people writing down a set of rules that make enough sense to enough people to say, yes, we agree to that. Those are good. That's a good foundation for a free and prosperous society. And as much as it's gone off the rails, it's almost still kind of, surprising that just a few words on a sheet of paper can persist as a rules of engagement for so long. It's just, and that's always how it's been, right? Like down to the Code of Hammurabi and like all laws afterwards. It's both the logic and rationale of the words and also the force backing up behind it, which necessarily has to be there. But I don't know, it's not a point. It's fascinating how powerful that can be, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
When did you so you said you came into Bitcoin in 21.
Yeah.
What was the initial, presumably you've been thinking about these topics for a long time. So what was the initial reaction?
So for me, since 2021, and I was trying to figure out what am I going to do with my money, because keeping it in dollars after the printing that happened because of COVID, I just had to put it in something outside of gold and silver. And my wife and I, we had our first son in 2020, and just trying to think about about him and his future, and shoring up his success. That led me down the path of investing. I started to, because of what I do for a living, I get to listen to a lot of podcasts during the day. So I started listening to the Investors Podcast, a network. And I noticed that every week there would be an episode specifically about Bitcoin. And eventually I started to listen to that, and then that was, I guess, the light bulb moment. And I went back and listened to all of Preston's podcast, and that was kind of just the unraveling at that point.
And so, when you started to appreciate what this was, especially in the context of having had an interest in libertarianism and anarchy before, how did it shift your mindset? How did it change how you saw things?
Before, I just had kind of resigned to, this is the state of the world. And, now having come to learn about Bitcoin, and, grasping it, at least from a very low level technological understanding, I saw it as the tool that the liberty movement, never had before. And I kind of wondered why the broader liberty movement really wasn't, why aren't they all Bitcoiners?
Well, part of the answer is because there's a big cohort that are gold bugs and just they don't think that Bitcoin has the resilience of gold because it relies on internet infrastructure and all that kind of stuff. And then my observations have been that another big cohort are shitcoiners for whatever reason. They just, I don't know why, but it seems like they're just thousand flowers bloom sort of thing, and they can't see the rationale for, a Bitcoin only sort of approach.
I think part of it is, it's technical understanding. And like I said, I'm not, technical compared to a lot of people in the space, but, I think if you can grasp just the magnificence of, cryptography without fully understanding it, the power of private public key cryptography. And, I think it's a function of that. And I just don't think they've kind of done enough due diligence to kind of incorporate that into their thesis.
Yeah, I think I agree. But I think the other thing is that, it is unprecedented what it actually represents. And so I can definitely have some patience with people that don't allow themselves to believe that it is what it might be. And that was certainly my position early on. I was very attracted to it politically, because I thought we needed outside money, non-state money in a modern world, and gold just wasn't going to cut it. But a big part of me was like, it can't work, it can't be, it can't be what I think it is, that would just be too outlandish. And maybe it's not, maybe it ends up not being what we think it is. That's an ever-present possibility. But I do think it matters what we expect of it, our engagement with it obviously matters. We run nodes, we use it, we contribute in various ways. So it's as they say about the Constitution, it's a living document. Bitcoin is a living money in that sense. And so, if your involvement, however small it may be, does actually matter in some way, why not try to make it matter in the direction of the best possible outcome? That's kind of my approach to what if it fails sort of thing.
Yeah, I think part of it, for the older generation, is just kind of, asking the question, how do paradigms change? It's not because, it's not because the incumbent, way of thinking changes their mindset. It's because they die off and a new generation with a different mindset becomes the majority. And that's what ultimately shifts paradigms.
Yeah. Yeah. I've often said and thought, like, imagine if because when I, poked my head up out of the matrix and started looking around, there wasn't much on offer in terms of solutions. There was just like big, fat, scary problems. And it's like, oh shit, there's really not much that can be done about this. But I, imagine a 20-year-old today who does the exact same thing, and he pops up, and not only does Bitcoin exist as a solution, but now it exists as a genuine cultural phenomenon where there's art, music, books, articles, podcasts, all sorts of stuff for you to really sink your teeth in. How much, I feel like it should be way easier for them to skip the kind of depressing, despondent phase and just dive right into the orange glory and get on with it, So
yeah, I have the same thought when I think about, my son and his future. He's born in 2020, and by the time he's my age, how old will Bitcoin be by then? And what, I don't know. It's fun to think about.
Yeah. It seems like, predicting the future is always kind of a fool's errand, right? But now even more so, just the way how fast things are changing. When you pour like Bitcoin into the mix and AI and, energy and everything else that's going on, how could you possibly predict 5 years in the future? I don't know how you could. There's just too much disruptive stuff, too many mega political technological shifts, let's say, going on that I think we're in for a lot of surprises.
Absolutely.
What I often like to explore the different ways that, well, actually referring back to the cultural phenomenon, like, why is it that it's become a cultural phenomenon? And I would say that at least a big part of that reason is because it has inspired people to act differently in terms of what they pursue, what kind of work they do, to treat themselves differently, to value things in their life differently, and to act and aspire in accord with that. And taken together, that kind of creates a parallel culture or a unique cultural emergence of some kind. And I'm just, I know it's relatively, you're relatively new to Bitcoin, coming in 21, but has there been that kind, those sorts of shifts in your perspective and or, behavior, aspirations, enthusiasm in
Personally,
life generally? Yeah.
I think Bitcoin is hope.
Well, that's
Not
a
that
pretty
I
big
was,
thing.
yeah, I mean, not that I was, depressed or, had any negative connotations, with my personal life or anything like that, I would say. But, it's just, like I said, wanting to achieve liberty, and just before just throwing your hands up saying, I don't think there's any good answer, to all of a sudden saying, not only is there's this practical answer, but when people can adopt it, not because it's anything, not because they think it has to do anything with liberty. They're just trying to improve their own personal selves, and in that process, achieves more liberty for everyone. I just, it's like the Trojan horse meme. People,
Right.
will go in there to make money, and they get liberty as well.
Mm-hmm. Totally. And personal responsibility and hope, as you say, and all the things that come with that. And I think that's the point, like it's so consequential how you look out into the world, and particularly into the world, like into the future, so the world as it is and the world as you think it could, should, or will, probabilistically be. That has such an impact on your day-to-day perspective and happiness. And I think that's part of the problem that so many people face today, and why, like diseases of despair, so-called depression and
Yeah.
anxiety and substance abuse are so rampant, because, and, very few people probably are able to identify and put together all the reasons why this is the case, what it is that's so destabilizing. But the felt sense of destabilization and decreasing security and certainty about the future definitely seems to be feeding into all those, illnesses or state of affairs, let's say, and contributing to an individual looking out on the world and being like, there's nothing there for me, like it doesn't cohere with anything that I believe in or want, or it looks like such an insurmountable whatever. It looked like it's going in such a, it's going in such a divergent direction from where I want it to go. My efforts are going to be useless in combating that. So why bother? So just give up, apathy, whatever.
Yeah.
And to have that change, and this is a spectrum. We probably all feel that to some degree, much lesser now, let's say with Bitcoin. But what Bitcoin seems to do is, once you begin to understand it, once you begin to appreciate the role money has in the society that flourishes or degrades on top of it, the institutions that bubble up, the laws, the authority, the unfairness, all that kind of stuff. Once you appreciate the link that money has to those things, and then you appreciate how kind of novel and pristine Bitcoin is in that way, I don't think you can help but have it, reconstruct your vision of the future and be like, wow, it can actually be way better. And if you see that and you actually believe it, it's not just, you're not just trying to tell yourself this, it's not just like a daily affirmation, as effective as those might be, but like you just look out and that's what you see in your heart of hearts. I don't think you can help it, but having it, well, one, having a very positive influence on your daily demeanor, like a little bit more, the world becomes a little bit brighter. You have a bit more energy. You are a bit more like, it causes you to care more about your life and the future, right? And that can bleed into so many different areas. And I think that's partially why we see, and I don't want to throw all Bitcoiners into the same basket, but you see a lot of, appreciation and desire for truth in all areas, not just in money or economics. You see it influencing how people treat themselves, the respect and dignity they have for themselves, that which they grant and engage with others, how they treat their body and their physiology and their health, how they use their time, typically wasting less time, trying to devote more and more time to meaningful endeavors. And all of that just seemingly because now that vision of the future is one that's brighter, that's far more worthwhile to try to engage in, achieve, be a part of, infuses you with an enthusiasm. And, so it's no small thing to say that something gives you hope, which I think is why I think Saylor probably popularized that more than anyone in saying that Bitcoin is hope. But it's so true, it's underappreciated how powerful that is.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine being a kid today and not having Bitcoin.
I can't imagine being me today not having Bitcoin. Can you imagine? You look out and you see clown world everywhere, and you're scrolling Twitter and everything's on fire, and you don't have Bitcoin.
Stuff.
Holy shit! I mean, what would you do? You'd be a gold bug again, which is what I
probably
was.
still be stacking
ass.
gold.
That's just totally unfulfilling and depressing. That doesn't create that hopeful thing on the horizon. That, to me, didn't change the horizon at all, because as we know, we're in this problem coming from a gold standard, coming from gold already having been money in our past. So it didn't change the future perception. All it did was, maybe it helps you weather the storm that's coming. Maybe, the thesis being like, well, when fiat money fails and we go into the Mad Max scenario, someone will take some gold for bread. It's like, maybe, but if you really play that scenario out, it's not that logical. It doesn't really make that much sense.
I'd rather have toilet paper or guns or
dry food and guns. Exactly.
That's more valuable than gold.
Yeah. So I mean, you say, like, imagine a kid, but it's almost a scary thing when I actually think about it, because the world is so messed up, on so many levels, not just the economic and monetary, but obviously the social, the cultural, political. And if you're telling me that Bitcoin wasn't there to be, a life raft economically and monetarily, but also, type of release valve socially and culturally. Like, if I didn't know all the people I've met from Bitcoin, if I wasn't so inspired by what's happening there, if I didn't know that there was a fairer, freer, more efficient, more logical parallel economy operating and being grown, like if I didn't, if none of that was present, man, I don't know, like, where my head would be at in this, in this day and age, because we Bitcoiners, we have a kind of, we're able to have a certain apathy about what's happening out in clown world, right? Now, not that we're totally insulated from it, because obviously we're not, but we're probably more insulated than most. And so we can kind of look back and be like, ha, look, it's that meme of like the two dudes on the bus, right? And one's looking at like the rainbow and the sunshine, and the other one's looking at like the darkness. And, that's kind of how Bitcoiners, I think, engage the world, because Bitcoin makes it so much easier to tolerate. But if that wasn't there, I mean, I think a lot of us are of the kind of mindset or demeanor or personality type that it would be affecting us dramatically. I mean, that's why we're in Bitcoin, probably because there was an impetus, right? There was like a necessity for us to find a solution to this stuff, because it was so troublesome to so many of us.
Yeah, I mean, you're hit it on the head right there.
So what in Bitcoin these days, since you've been in, I mean, what is your primary interest or focus, or what's kind of intriguing you these days about, I mean, it doesn't even have to be in Bitcoin, but all roads kind of lead back to Bitcoin. So what's top of mind for you these days?
I like the metaphor that you use about Bitcoin being a lifeboat. And I know there's a lot of people that, are concerned with, Bitcoin adoption and utility, and like the transaction fees in the future being enough to be the security budget. And for me, I just kind of see Bitcoin as, like I said, a lifeboat. And we're at the stage where, us early adopters, we're sitting on the lifeboat. We saw the iceberg hit the ship. We know the ship there's critical failure. It's going down. It's just that that knowledge isn't dispersed evenly amongst all the people on board. And I think that for me, it's just trying to promote making the lifeboat as big as possible. Because I don't think right now we're quite there yet in terms of scaling to a point where we could, if tomorrow every 8 billion people wanted to get on the Bitcoin network, I don't know how that would work. And trying to advocate for the builders out there to build ways of changing that. That's what I'm always trying to focus on learning about and kind of promoting.
Are we mentioned earlier that in 2011 or so, you were kind of advocating to friends and family for the merits of a different political philosophy and anarchy.
Yeah.
Do you try to orange pill people in your life these days, or do you just focus your efforts
To be
elsewhere?
honest, yeah, like I think I have a little bit of like PTSD from trying to like, I guess, red pill or black pill, family
Right.
and friends from back in the day, and just you get nowhere, and you're just kind of okay, whatever. I'm done trying to not orange pill, trying to persuade you. And I think that's kind of stayed the course since I've been a Bitcoiner. I haven't really tried to orange pill my family too hard. I got them some Bitcoin for the holidays, and talked with them a little about it, but I didn't want to kind of try to beat them over the head with it like I did with Liberty before. Like we were talking about earlier, I think it'll be one of those things where they'll come back to me at a certain point in the future, and then at that point in time, they'll be more receptive to receiving the message.
Right. Totally. How do you think about, we touched on this before, but because of your interest, I'd like to dig a little bit back into it.
Sure.
How do you think governance will evolve in a Bitcoin, in a Bitcoin denominated, hyper-Bitcoinized or Bitcoinizing world? So there's two interesting questions there, right? One is kind of the transition. How does Bitcoin affect how politics changes over the next, say, 50 years? And how do you, there's no ultimate end, but in a world where Bitcoin is dominant money, how do you think governance functions in a world like that?
I don't, I think it could happen in a couple different ways. I think there's a future where, Bitcoin obviously takes the money away from the state and the power that gives the state, but it's not the state's only, mode of power. And, in one place I could see where it could lead to, more decentralized, local, smaller states, which would be great. But there's another scenario where I could see the state kind of co-opting Bitcoin and kind of trying to use it in tandem with trying to, achieve its kind of nefarious ends. Like a question that I have for Bitcoiners out there is, let's say the government they throw their hands up and say, you know what, you guys are right, fiat is a failure. The CBDC thing that we were trying, that's obviously a failure too. We are going to go with the Bitcoin standard because it's the only way to dig us out of the hole that we're in. My fear is that in that type of scenario, that maybe not at first, but over time, the government will use either natural or type of maybe possibly manufactured crises to kind of exert more power over the people. And I don't think it's very far-fetched to say that the government could say, we are on the brink of annihilation, whether it's the environment, a virus, we're at war, our energy grid is going to fail, our food supplies are going to fail. If we don't control everything, right? That, you know, we are going to be annihilated. And yeah, Bitcoin will get us there, but, you know, we have to control things, and you're going to have to, you know, tax, you know, instead of like the 30%, whatever it is now, we'd have to tax you 50, 60, 70, 80%. And the question I have for Bitcoiners is, you know, for the sake of argument, let's say that they had to tax you at the same rate, so that the value that was extracted from you is, you know, the same that it is now through inflation and taxation. But now it's all direct taxation, and it's a Bitcoin standard.
Yeah, I mean, it's a valid question. I think my first response is this is part of the reason why privacy tools and approaches are so important in Bitcoin, because, you know, more private you can be, the less surface area there is to attack you, whether it's a state or other form of so-called attacker. But you're right to wonder, in my opinion, like what the consequences of the failure of fiat will be. And as you say, I mean, the state still has the monopoly on violence, and notwithstanding, the more the money fails and the more useless the money printer is, I mean, you do have to pay that enforcement costs, right? And this is part of the thesis of the kind of atrophy. In the best case, the atrophy of the state is simply not able to pay its bills and not able to pay for as much enforcement. But, you know, that could drag on for quite some time. So I think, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but at least from the current vantage point, is Bitcoin allows you to more easily engage in jurisdictional arbitrage, right? So, you know, you can take your wealth with you, as everyone knows. So if it becomes overbearing in your jurisdiction, hopefully you're able to make it to another jurisdiction physically, and that may solve some of your problems. Now, it may not solve the grander problem, because one, maybe there won't be that many jurisdictions to go to, and two, maybe the ones that are available, you know, become the targets geopolitically of the incumbent, you know, large powers, which is certainly possible. You know, like El Salvador is a great current case. I mean, things look good there, you know, sensible policies, you know, more freedom, smaller government, that kind of thing. But it's a tiny Central American country. And if the powers that be, so-called, want to stop the flight to that place, I mean, they probably have a number of tools in their tool belt to do it. And the last 100 years of American intervention in Central and South America is probably a pretty good blueprint for how that might take place. Now, I'm extreme, you know, I don't say that happily, because that would sadden me. And I very much hope that the world is in a different place now, and they're able to maintain the experiment that they're running. You know, I very much hope that, because I want as many kind of bastions of relative freedom to emerge in the world, so that those options exist. But, you know, of course, it has to be part of the analysis that, well, what if those places just, you know, get undermined in some way, whether it's through media or through military or through financial oppression of various kinds, you know, you know, all the strings that that are available. So, I mean, it's a great question. And it would be great if a sufficient number of people in the world appreciated the value of individual freedom enough that there wouldn't be enough so-called political will for such things to happen. However, the COVID years seem to indicate that people can be tricked or fooled or, you know, coerced into completely forgetting the value of certain fundamental principles around freedom, and that, you know, that doesn't bode well for their chances at not being coerced or tricked again in the future. So, you know, who knows?
Temporarily suspend, you know, your freedoms for safety to deal with the crisis.
I mean, true, you know, so I stand by that statement. And it, you know, it was very concerning to see how easy it was to convince people to, you know, part of the problem here is that insofar as those, you know, let's say, principles that were enshrined in the American Constitution, insofar as they were good and enlightened and useful, as we discussed earlier, can't really stand the test of time. But for all did all right, all things considered. Most people have no appreciation for even those things. I mean, you asked if you asked every single American, first of all, what was in, the Constitution, but even furthermore, can you explain a little bit the value of these principles that were enshrined? Why are they so critical to maintain for a peaceful and prosperous society? How many do you think would be able to articulate the importance of some of those principles?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even think most people would think that, that Genesis, we were United States, a federated republic of states, and not, a one federal government. I don't even think most people, understand that distinction.
Right. So in that context, I mean, and this is part of my, I don't find there's much benefit in like being overly critical about things these days, right? I'd rather just kind of contribute to discussions about solutions and kind of aspirational sort of discussions. But one of the things that is very dangerous, I guess, to put it one way, is that so few people actually appreciate how, to the degree they have freedom and prosperity and peace now, how that is established. I think so many people, you're born into the world. And if you're born into a really shitty place, perhaps you have to think about that more, because it's, you don't have the luxury of not thinking about it as much. But if you're born into a place of relative calm and peace, then you just think, well, this is how things are. This is almost like, this is how nature works. And it's not that at all, right? The circumstance you're born into, there's a reason why it is the way it is, right? Doesn't matter where you're born into. And in places where it's relatively good, notwithstanding all the problems it may have, what are the reasons for that? And I think when these events happen where people get hysterical and the fear gets dialed up, and people get censored for opposing views, and a very kind of singular minded perspective on a particular issue, and that causes all of this illogical, irrational, immoral behavior. Part of the reason for that is because so few people are actually thinking, does this violate the principles that allow for optimal flourishing, optimal freedom, prosperity, and peace? Are we violating those principles by responding or acting in this particular way? And if they did that, and I think a lot of, Bitcoiners, amongst other people, did do that, that's why it's so concerning, because it's like, you don't realize you violate these principles so easily in the face of a perceived danger. And of course, we know how not dangerous that perceived danger was. And also we have examples of the past, and don't ask me who said the quote, nor I'm not going to get the quote right, but it was something like, if you would give away your freedoms for safety, then you deserve neither. There's so many.
I think it's Benjamin Franklin, I think.
Right. There's so many examples throughout history of people cautioning about making that mistake, just letting fear override the foundational principles that have allowed for the relatively prosperous and free circumstance that prevails. And something relatively minor comes up, and a huge portion of people just completely overlook the importance of that. That's what was scary to me, and that's what's scary to me moving forward. The only silver lining is that I don't know how to judge how many people, but there seems to have been a lot of red pilling, for lack of a better term, as a result of COVID. And so maybe that bodes well for not having so many people respond in that way in the future. But again, who knows what portion of people that actually is.
Yeah. A lot of people go throughout their day-to-day lives, kind of living an unexamined life.
Yeah.
And that's kind of just the nature. How do you encourage people to kind of think about the world differently? That's, that's a really hard question. And, just looking at politics today, the government controls, so much of our liberties now. Is it really any wonder that, we see so much, aggression and violence being espoused politically? Because, it's self-defense when you boil it down. There's a metaphor from Lysander Spooner. He's talking about voting, and by voting, do you consent to the system? And the analogy he uses is kind of to paraphrase it, is a man like a gladiator in the arena. If you don't fight, you will be killed. So you fight to survive. But just because you're fighting to survive, that doesn't mean you consent to that system.
Yeah. And one of the, another thing that's, I think, a reason for hope is that, as you said earlier, I mean, people come to Bitcoin for number go up and they end up staying for a lot of other things. And I wonder if that's a way to backdoor an appreciation for these, the values and principles that are generally promoting peace and prosperity. Because I think that, that's what's in Bitcoin, the fact that everyone's subjected to, the same rules, in that it's a fair system, and that, it can't lie to itself, basically, and you can't lie to it. So it only propagates truth. I mean, and because of the tool it represents, I mean, you can invite more freedom in your life, but the flip side of that coin is you have to take more responsibility. And so even if you're only in it for, number go up, it's almost like it backdoors these principles, or at least an appreciation for them, because you can't really avail of the benefits of it without implicitly accepting those principles. And I think that's part of the reason why we're in this situation we're in, because, most of the things we're talking about have not been explicit dismissals or violations of what we would deem to be the proper principles to orient an individual and to orient a society. The institutions grow up and the power dynamics change, and people are kind of forced in a Stockholm syndrome kind of way to implicitly comply to things that they know are wrong, but they're just they do it subconsciously because it's almost too disruptive to do it consciously. And I think Bitcoin might act in the reverse, in that it's now inculcating and causing you to implicitly agree to principles that are actually the good principles, the generative principles. And even if you're not conscious of that, you're going to feel the effects of it one way or the other. And you're also going to contribute to the strength and propagation of those principles one way or the other. And so it's almost like the insidious danger of subconscious processes, or it's almost like Bitcoin is a psyop for the good guys. It's like I
agree. Like
unconsciously going through life would be like a dangerous thing, right? Because you're susceptible to all these influences. But if you just kind of attach yourself to Bitcoin and do it properly, you then become passively inculcated with things that are actually beneficial to you, and to society, and that's great as far as I'm concerned.
I think that Bitcoiners are, prime candidates to kind of explore these ideas more than any subset of society for those exact reasons.
So what do you see? I mean, are you just kind of in the mindset of stay humble, stack sats for the foreseeable, or is Bitcoin, something that you'd like to be more involved in the future, or how do you think about it?
Trying to stay humble. My skill set doesn't necessarily lend itself to, working in Bitcoin per se.
Are you public about what you do?
I work in construction. So yeah,
like homes or what?
Electrical. Yeah.
Well, this is, I've talked about this many times before. like, I think Bitcoiners are going to want to do business with Bitcoiners, and not even just people who also accept Bitcoin and then, like, you know, convert it to fiat. But if you knew
Yeah.
there was, if you needed electrical work done in your area and you knew there was a Bitcoin electrician, for example, or whatever, like plumber, contractor, teacher, lawyer, whatever, wouldn't you preferentially want to work
Yeah,
with them? Because
absolutely.
you almost, there's a high probability you already have established like a lot of alignment on certain values. And so if, you know, presuming the price is relatively similar between your options, of course you'd pick the Bitcoiner, right? And so I think, I mean, I'm sure there'll be job, you know, boards and stuff like that emerging in the next couple of years where like you can more easily connect with Bitcoiners for, you know, work or hiring stuff and that kind of stuff. But I think we're, you know, we're going to need Bitcoiners doing everything in society.
Yeah.
So it's,
Yeah. I mean, we're all Bitcoiners, right?
yeah. And wouldn't it be, you know, wouldn't it be great? You know, maybe this is the part where we kind of sound crazy. And I meet a ton of lovely people in my day-to-day life. So I'm kind of saying this tongue in cheek, but also kind of not. But wouldn't it be great if, like, when you went to the butcher, you knew he was a Bitcoiner, and when you went to the bakery, perhaps if you eat bread occasionally, and they were Bitcoiners, and you know your kids' teachers were Bitcoiners, and you know the pilot of your American Airlines flight was a Bitcoiner. I don't know, like it would instill in me an additional sense of comfort, even above and beyond, you know, the character or personality that I might, you know, interface with when I'm interacting with them.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think if you kind of think of the Bitcoiners' thesis on fiat, eventually, you know, everyone will go to a better form of money, and then naturally we'll have more and more, you know, services that want Bitcoin for
Right.
Bitcoin's sake.
And I think that's part of it, right? Because you think the thinking, at least part of it is if I'm working with a Bitcoiner, I'm less likely like to receive a fiat job for, like, there's this perhaps there's this thinking that, like, well, they'll probably take more pride in their work. Maybe that's the right way of putting it. You know, there'll be less fiat about their work, regardless of what they do. Like there'll be more proof in their work. It'll be of higher quality. At least that's the assumption. I mean, I know I'm being super idealistic right now, and but I think as things progress and as more and more people come in, and as more and more people kind of begin to appreciate the change that's happening, I mean, the market will even direct that eventually. I think people will be more incentivized to produce better quality work and to have better relationships with their customers. And because there won't be as many fallbacks, or there won't be like, they'll have the capacity to do better work, to have more time available to do better work. People will have more to compensate them for better work, all that kind of stuff. So that's the hope, at least, that's the
Yeah,
kind of
you know,
scenario we're going into.
especially for like the early adopters, and if you can find people now that will take Bitcoin, yeah, I think that's definitely the case. Um, you know, and if we get to a hyper Bitcoinized world where everyone is using Bitcoin, I'm kind of leery about saying that everyone will kind of espouse those ideas, because I think that, you know, we get to a point in hyper Bitcoinization, not because, you know, everyone has these, you know, these change, you know, these moments where they kind of look at the world in a different way, and that kind of leads to them altering their behavior. I think, you know, people will adopt Bitcoin just because, you know, it's the best money.
Yeah.
And just like, you know, it's just like people and driving cars, like, you know, you have a deeper appreciation if you know how the car works. And but, you know, everyone drives a car, and not everyone knows how it works. They don't appreciate, you know, how the engine works.
I totally agree. And my two senses about that is that it kind of goes, one point goes back to it there being kind of an implicit or subconscious inculcation that takes place, just as fiat right now like, and all the society and the market that it creates and all the signals that it propagates, that perverts people's behavior, I would say. And I don't think that's too contentious. And likewise, I think Bitcoin will do the same. But I absolutely agree that not everyone will appreciate every, philosophical, technical, social, cultural element of it and be, a hardened Bitcoiner, far from it. But I
Yeah.
am hopeful that those signals that are being propagated and the institutions or lack thereof that emerge around it will inculcate and over time influence perspective and behavior.
Yeah. My hope is that, a Bitcoinized world, is kind of the fertile ground, necessary for, these kind of principles to thrive and grow.
Yeah, absolutely. The flip side of that is, to whatever degree people are resistant to that kind of change, and on the way to getting there, how many concessions will be made and how much will that neuter the ultimate potential positive impact, i.e., if we keep saying like, well, not everyone's going to self-custody Bitcoin, not everyone's going to self-custody Bitcoin, not everyone even can self-custody Bitcoin, these sorts of things, then do we end up recreating the old system, or at least like partially creating that? And so like, well, you're never going to get 8 billion people to be responsible for the money. So we have to create custodial solutions. And then you slowly wind up back in the same place with some different attributes, maybe not as bad, but some of the same problems persist. And so how do you walk that line as we march toward, this non-utopic future that we're talking about, but certainly a better future than we've had?
That question of like self-custody is something that I kind of think about every now and then and come back to it. Just how are 8 billion people going to be able, even if they want to, I mean, that's a whole separate issue. Even if they want to self-custody, is it even feasible on the layer one? And, for the developers out there, what do those custody model solutions look like if the last billion people have to interact with Bitcoin on several layers up? And you're right, it could lead to a type of bad scenario where we have similar problems that we have today because of that. So yeah, that's why that is something that comes to mind often for me, and I don't have a solution. Trying to support the builders out there, and hopefully they can figure out some smart way of doing it.
Yeah, it's a tough, it's a tricky question that nobody has the answer to. You alluded to earlier the fact that the incentive to adopt better money is going to bring a lot of people in, which of course I agree with. To what extent will the incentive to self-custody cause more people than we might otherwise think to adopt the capacity to do so, setting aside the technological question around whether they can or not, but whether they would want to? So I think necessity will and incentive will cause a lot to do that, because perhaps the benefits of doing so will so far exceed custodial solutions that people will not want to be left in the dust, as it were. But still, a huge portion of people will probably struggle to do that. And
I think it comes back to the thing about personal responsibility. Right. And a lot of people just that's uncomfortable for them to try to say, I have my value, all my value stored, I'm responsible for that. There's no one I can call if I do something wrong. That I just think that a lot of people don't want that right now.
Absolutely. I mean, we've all grown up and therefore been conditioned in a system that is basically the opposite of that.
Yeah.
Right. Like, delegate everything to someone else. Like, and that's what something like free healthcare incentivizes. You don't worry, like, do whatever the hell you want, because when you get sick, it's not going to be your responsibility. It's going to be the responsibility of someone else. So have at it, go for it, and give all your money to these banks, and, let the central bank debase it. And, you go down through a person's life today, and you could see how you'd be able to identify how much they've abdicated responsibility for so many things. And, some people have characterized Bitcoin as kind of the personal responsibility revolution, because it starts with the thing that is most consequential, perhaps, to have under your control, which is the fruits of your labor, the emblem of your sacrifice and energy, i.e. your money. And so, you know, if you can get over that hurdle, and I think actually we see this in Bitcoin land, if you can get over that hurdle and actually do that, it becomes easier to do it in other areas, whether it's regarding your health or whether it's regarding your education or whatever. But as you say, we're coming from possibly the apex of lack of responsibility, lack of personal responsibility in human history, being that, you know, the size and influence of the state is potentially bigger now than it ever has been. And so that's inculcated in people an attitude of just let the nanny state take care of it. And Bitcoin being the opposite of that is going to require a shift in perspective, you know, for people that want to take advantage of what lies on the other side of that. But yeah, it probably will be a slow process, to say the least.
To kind of piggyback on that, you know, Bitcoin really, you know, gets at the heart of, you know, self-determination, and the existing system that we've been talking about really is about, you know, installing kind of the victim or mentality where you're just creating excuses and not taking responsibility for your life, that you are the creator of your life. So much today, it's people like, you know, I could have been this, but then this happened in the world and this happened to me. I'm powerless to do anything about it. And I think that, you know, it's a lot of the apathy that we see out there because of that.
Totally. Back to your question about how this plays out, you know, if there's more resistance to individuals deciding to adopt this technology, let's say, have you given thought to jurisdictional arbitrage? Like, is that something that's in your mental model for how to, you know,
I mean, I think it has to be. Unfortunately, I think you have, if you're going to be pragmatic, you have to at least have it in the back of your mind that that is, you know, a reality that you may have to deal with. And I don't want that. You know, I just started laying roots with, you know, making a family. The last thing I want to do is to have to move to a different location because of, you know, this type of horrific infringement of our liberties. Yeah.
Well, we shall see. Mike, is there anything else that you wanted to cover or discuss today before we shut it down?
I think we kind of covered a lot of the stuff that I wanted to talk about. Again, yeah, the impetus for me reaching out to you was kind of just to, you know, ask those Bitcoiners out there that, you know, do kind of interpret the experience as, you know, living a more examined life, to kind of, you know, go down the rabbit hole of anarchy, and not just maybe not to simply dismiss it as the caricatures that it gets portrayed as, because I do think it is important. I think a lot of Bitcoiners, you know, really think that, you know, they see what's going on with the world and that it's wrong, that they see wrong in the world, and they think if we can just get Bitcoin to be adopted by the state, that will lead, you know, that will lead to prosperity. And you know, my point of view, how I see things, is I don't necessarily think that's the case. For me, you know, fiat is just like the shackles that the state uses to kind of control the populace. And if you remove their shackles, it doesn't make you free. So I would just want to encourage, you know, Bitcoiners to kind of, you know, to kind of go down the liberty movement and, you know, decide for yourself if you haven't gone down there already.
Well, maybe we didn't fully flesh this out a few minutes ago when I asked you, but just before we sign off, I'm curious, because, you know, this topic comes up all the time, you know, because there's progressive Bitcoiners, there's libertarian Bitcoin, ANCAP. And, you know, one group is saying, how could you possibly be a progressive in Bitcoin? It's completely antithetical to, you know, what it stands for, and it still requires theft, all this kind of stuff. And again, you know, I kind of default to just not what I want in the I default to trying to find the balance between what I want in the ideal and what is pragmatically possible in the era that I'm living in, right? And that doesn't boil down to easy positions. Usually, it requires lengthy, nuanced discussions on specific points to try to figure out, where we might fall and what might be the best approach, not just, well, I'm on this side and you're on that side and, you're an idiot. But I'm curious because I did ask this and I'm not sure if I heard your answer, but in a Bitcoin, so not in the transition, in a Bitcoin world, let's say everyone owns Bitcoin. There's other currencies. Bitcoin's the dominant asset. I know there's a lot of assumptions here, so it might be an unanswerable question, but I'll throw it over to you and just saying, I mean, what does an anarchic form of governance look like in a world where Bitcoin is the prime money, let's say?
Oh, I would hope that it would be a world where, all services that are, traditionally provided by the government are instead provided by the market. And, I think that Bitcoin and, other technologies kind of would hopefully enable those type of systems of cooperation instead of systems of coercion to flourish and grow.
And I understand that, but what is the role of force in such a society? And I'll add a little bit to that. Like, everything always generates a hierarchy, right? In business, in sports, in nature, right? Like the cream rises to the top, let's say, so force will still exist in that environment, I presume, because authority, I think there will still be the necessity for authority that's outside of the capacity for Bitcoin to establish. So you would still need a form of authority outside the money, let's say. And to enforce that authority, it seems like you might need force. And I understand that the kind of argument about, private security forces and this kind of thing, but does there not have to be for some things, a type of arbiter of authority? Would that not need force? And back to our earlier discussion, and even if we remove that premise and just say, wherever the sources of force are, whether they be so-called public or so-called private, there will be an appreciation for which is the most powerful, because that's just how, dynamics play out in any sort of natural environment. And so how do you treat the dominant power force entity capable of inflicting violence in a society, culture, market like the one you're describing?
So I guess the first thing is, you ask what the role of force would be. I think that there would be private security systems, and they would have force that would be similar to what we have today, but it's based off of this idea of consent and kind of lost my train of thought.
Do you think there would be wars between the private security forces? That's kind of an easier way of me saying what I said before.
Yeah, I don't think that there would be, because they'd be economically incentivized to work together, because there's a cost to violence that is a higher cost than cooperation. And if these private, defense contractors are in the business of actually being private contractors that are getting their proceeds voluntarily, then they have to, they have to be concerned with their bottom line and providing that type of service. And if they go and pillage or go to war, there's a cost to that. And those service providers will have to bear the cost. And if I have to choose between service providers, the one that is, going out and causing war, there's going to be a higher fee to my premium. So I'm economically incentivized to not use them. I'd go somewhere else. And then I think the other point you were making is, what's to stop, the state from coming back again, essentially. And that really boils down, in my opinion, to, you know, the masses of individuals and their consent to that. And to a certain extent, yeah, you can't stop a warlord, but there's difference in shifting between consenting and non-consenting.
Yeah. I think this is obviously a complex topic. We're not going to solve it here today at the end of a podcast, but I do think one of the things that bodes extremely well, because you mentioned there's a cost to being an aggressor in that sort of a model. One of the things that bodes extremely well is that it seems like more and more value will be siphoned into the Bitcoin realm, let's say. And so I think the physical world, the value that we ascribe to things in our physical world, let's say the market price that we ascribe to things in our physical world, will greatly diminish to the extent that it's there, that they're being used as a so-called store of value. And so I think a lot of that will, you know, kind of collapse, if you will, into Bitcoin, into a realm that's not as susceptible, quite impervious to physical violence and extraction via those means. And so the incentive to physical violence in the future in that type of a world will be much less, because the rewards of doing so will be much less, because out in the world, the so-called value that's imbued in things out in the world, X Bitcoin, will be so much less. Now, the flip side of that might be the attacks on Bitcoin, the ways of scheming, hacking, phishing, you know, all that kind of stuff will scale up dramatically with Bitcoin's value and market cap, because if all the value in the world is in there now, then the evil masterminds of the world will be doing their darndest to extract wealth from there, and not through physical force and coercion, which, you know, maybe you might make the argument that's a better problem to have, because it's not as damaging or invasive to people's livelihoods and lives and that kind of stuff. But anyways, maybe a conversation for another time.
It's going to be interesting to see how, you know, the cost of violence, as that becomes more prohibitive, how that impacts how our systems kind of evolve over time.
Yeah, exactly. And what bodes extremely well is that if we're making the assertion that the return on investment for violence is about to decrease substantially, then stands to reason that violence itself will decrease substantially. And that would be absolutely excellent in my estimation. So, Mike, appreciate the time today. Great to finally connect face to face, and we'll have to do it again sometime.
Thanks, John.
All right, brother. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Bye.